My encounter with the Dogman happened to me when I was by myself at the house that me and my brother share in Tennessee. It happened in 2001. What's funny is there are things I remember very vividly. Oh, so stupid little details that have no point in the story, but I figured I'd put them in anyways because they're the things that I remembered about this encounter. All I know is other portions of the story, like how I reacted after I saw the Dogman, are completely gone from my memory. It's like I blacked it out or something. Maybe it's my mind trying to protect me. This is the only time I saw something like this, and I still can't believe that I was the one that actually saw something like it to begin with. I'm a pretty private person, as you can tell by my email address. I don't use my real name. I want to keep my name out of this just for privacy's sake, and the exact location I don't want to give out because this is still on the property that my brother and I own. I will tell you that it happened in Middle Tennessee, and that we're pretty far out from other people. Our nearest neighbor is about 2 miles down the street. But that didn't stop my brother from erecting this wooden fence to signal where our property line was in our backyard. It's because of this fence that maybe I didn't see the Dogman as quickly as I should have, but this fence could have also been the barrier that maybe even saved my life. When it happened, it was about 4 in the afternoon. My brother hadn't gotten home from work yet, and I was at home by myself. I was in the backyard having a cigarette and probably daydreaming about something or other. One of the stupid little details that I remember is playing with this little pedal with my foot before all of this happened. The next thing I knew, everything went really quiet, or at least I stopped daydreaming enough to realize that it was quiet. Hell, I don't even know exactly how long it was quiet before I realized it, so it could have been a couple of minutes, or it could have happened as soon as I noticed it. I looked around to try to figure out what was going on. Usually our property is as noisy as hell with birds and bugs and other critters, but at this point in time, none of those critters were making any noise at all. As I was scanning the property, I noticed movement at the fence, but on the opposite side that I was on. It looked like something big was shuffling around the other side, so it definitely piqued my interest. The fence itself is 6.5 feet tall, which is 3 inches taller than myself. Whatever was moving on the other side looked like it was about 5.5 feet tall and was shuffling around. The fence is wood, just normal slats, wooden. There's these tiny little gaps in between each piece. The gaps aren't big enough to see through at the distance that I was at, but if you walked right up to it, you could look through without any problem. From where I was at, you could definitely see movement and the light being blocked out from the gaps in between the fence posts. Right on the other side of the fence is this big tree that had been there for only God knows how long. Some of the branches were hanging over our side of the fence, and others stuck out in the direction where this big mass was walking around. After my encounter, I went to the tree limbs to measure the distance from the ground to the limb. It was 9.5 feet tall off the ground. Keep that in mind for later on in the story. At first, those movements looked like a big dark mass that was pivoting back and forth like somebody would if their legs were getting tired, or if they were shifting their weight, or if it was trying to get a good look through the slats of wood. It looked like whatever it was trying to peer through the fence because the top half, which I'm assuming was its head, was bobbing back and forth like it was trying to see through the slats. It looked very human at first, and I figured it was some trespasser that was trying to look into our land, or maybe my brother had gotten off work early and was trying to scare me. Wouldn't be the first time. We just have that kind of relationship. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I watched it for a few seconds and realized that whatever this thing was looked like it was really trying to keep out of sight. I thought maybe it was a bear or something like that, but this was very peculiar behavior for a bear. And it reverted back to my thoughts that it was my brother trying to scare me. I wasn't going to let him get the best of me. I got up, moving quietly and slowly, trying to act as casual as possible. I wanted to get a better look, but if it was my brother, I was going to beat him to the jump and scared him instead. I chuckled to myself, but tried not to be obvious. I was going to ruin this scare for sure. As I moved closer, though, this thing must have noticed me and started standing perfectly still. Then after a few seconds, it looks like it was backing away from the fence. Still, I crept closer, though, and tried to remain as casual as possible. I grabbed the fence at the top with my hands and looked over it. I never should have done that. What I saw has been the source of a lot of nightmares since then. I think I yelled out something like, "What in the hell?" What I was looking at was an honest-to-God wolfman, but it was about 40 feet away from me. It was still close enough to make me want to piss all over myself, to drop dead from a heart attack right then and there. It was moving in the direction away from me, and was doing this crouch and walk like it was trying to sneak away. It turned and looked back at me, and my blood ran cold. I don't know if you've ever felt that kind of fear, but it felt like my blood actually ran cold. My entire body started to freeze, and I was numb. This thing was moving away from me on only 2 legs. I was looking at a monster. As it turned back and went from a crouch and walk position to standing up to its complete height, I swear to you that this thing was over 8 feet tall. Its arms were heavily muscled, especially at the neck area and the thigh area. Its arms hung down past its knees, and where paws should have been on the front limbs looked more like these humanoid hands, almost like a raccoon. There were long claws or nails at the ends of these hands. The anatomy of the upper arms looked more human than canine. It looked like if I had hung my arms down to my sides, only a lot longer and completely covered in thick hair. And of course extremely buff. The chest area also had long fur on it, but it looked more matted around the chest and shaggy around the abdomen. And the legs, it looked like it was standing on its toes like a dog does. I'm not really sure why that's a question of interest that you asked me, but the legs looked more canine than human. This thing did have a long tail that looked bushy, just like the rest of its body. I didn't see any anatomy either, so I couldn't verify whether or not it was male or female, but based off the fact that I couldn't see a penis, I'm going to go on a limb and say this animal was female. As far as what the head looked like, well, it looked like a wolf, or a werewolf. Picture any werewolf movie you've ever seen on TV, and that's what it looked like. It had long teeth, it had a long snout, and a nose that looked wet to me. I could see its lips curl up. It had predatory eyes, and it also had pointed ears that were more towards the top of its head than the sides of its head. She just stood there staring at me, doing nothing but breathing. And then, she was as still could be. I was frozen, and couldn't run away. I was privileged, if that's what you want to call it, to seeing this wide grin spread across this thing's face. And let me tell you this, it was the most evil look I've ever seen anything give in all my life. At 52 years old, at this moment, I can still tell you I've never felt fear grip me like it did in that moment. Because the look on this creature's face just had this feeling of evil and malice. She continued to stare at me, and I really felt like I was locked in her glare. It felt like a stare down or something. It felt like I had a million thoughts screaming through my head at the same moment, but also this hazy, confused feeling as well. All I knew is that if this monster started running at me, I was going to barricade myself in my house and grab my shotgun. But I was also scared because sooner or later I knew my brother would be home. So if I was locked in the house with this creature outside trying to get in, he'd have no way of knowing where it was. It wasn't a risk that I wanted to take. I loved my brother, and I didn't want to see him end up as dog food. Then this thing looked like it was falling over at first, I guess. But what it was actually doing was dropping to all fours. And as it did, there was this loud popping noise, like when you pop one of your bones, but a lot louder. And it stood there looking at me for a second on all fours. And I swear to you, even on all fours, this thing had to be like 5 feet tall. And then, as fast as this encounter happened, it ended. because she turned around and trotted off back into the forest. It took another look back, and I think it helped me realize what was going on. Like, that haze that my mind was going through was lifted. I could think again. And then she turned around and went into the woods without a second look. I wanted to run. I knew I could run at this point, but I still stood there at that fence for a long time, just staring at that area where she went off to, trying to figure out what in the hell just happened to me. After that, though, is where I blacked out all the information, because I don't know how I got back into the house. I don't remember going back into the house at all. I didn't remember that day, and I don't remember all these years later. I don't remember the time it took getting into the house to the time it took to my brother getting home. I don't remember grabbing my shotgun, but I did, because it was in my hands when I told my brother. As he pulled up, I walked out there as calmly as I could with my shotgun over my shoulder, and he was curious about what was going on. I remember him eyeing the shotgun up and down and giving me this perplexed look, but in between those moments, I have no idea what happened. I told him what happened, at least the parts that I could remember. I got him to come into the house before I told him the story, and I poured each one of us a glass of whiskey. He didn't believe it was a wolfman. He thought that maybe it was some kind of bear, but after a while I convinced him that I saw some kind of supernatural creature, and eventually he came to terms with it too. That night, I slept with the lights on. Now, you show me a grown man here in Tennessee that actually sleeps with the lights on, and I'll pay you whatever debt you have. But here I was, a grown man, clutching my shotgun, sleeping with all the lights on in my room. I went out on the other side of the fence the next day and looked around, trying to see if I could find some kind of evidence, something that said that that Dogman creature was there. All I found were deep scratch marks in the tree that was right next to the fence. That's where those branches come in that I was talking about earlier. Because that branch that I was looking at was over 9 feet high. And I bet you my bottom dollar that it was the Dogman that made the scratches near that branch, because the scratches themselves were also about 9 feet off the ground. Like I said earlier, I haven't seen it again, and my brother has never had the misfortune of running into it, but we did have a friend down the way that found a large deer that was eviscerated. Not only that, the poor creature's head was missing. Now, you can blame it on a poacher. We do get some out here. You go right ahead and say it was a poacher. Be my guest. But because I saw this thing in the same area that that poor deer was ripped apart, I'm willing to bet you that that Dogman creature was what was responsible for killing it. This encounter has not tested my faith. I'm a Christian man that believes in God. I say my prayers every night. I believe it was His grace that protected me from this creature, and after reading a lot of encounters and threads, there's a lot of people that believe that we're seeing more of them because it's signaling the end of times. I'm ready for that. I've made my peace with this world, and I know that I'm going to spend eternity with God. I know these things are supposed to be a myth. Lots of people say they don't exist. You don't have to convince me. I just don't know exactly what they are. Whether they're a natural species or if they are something that crawled out of hell to cause Armageddon. Either way, I hope I never have another run-in with one of them. Sincerely, a grown man that still sleeps with his lights on every now and then, from Tennessee. I would like you to listen to my Dogman encounter, and I would like you to help me tell the world what I have seen, and make them understand I know what I've seen, and I'm not crazy. Because of this encounter, it's left me uneasy, and I'm scared people won't take me seriously. Because of that, I won't give my name, the owner of the land's name, or my friend's name, who was there with me when we had this encounter. Growing up, my best friend and I always loved the woods and the outdoors, and because of this, we saw an opportunity to go out into the woods, so we took it. Anytime, anywhere, if we had that opportunity, we went out into the woods. It was just like our religion. Out there, we saw a lot of animals, And we've seen some things that look like Bigfoot, but I'm not here to talk about him, because as far as I'm concerned, he's just a gentle giant. I'm here to talk about something I've seen that has caused me to lose interest in my beloved woods. A family friend of my father's side asked me and my friend if we could get rid of some coyotes that had been stalking his property. Because of his age, he couldn't do it himself, so he had asked us. When we had the time, we went out to his property, just like he asked. We decided to go to the back section of the property because that's where we thought we'd have the best chance of running into these coyotes. I was armed with a 45-70 lever-action rifle. My buddy had a 12-gauge pump shotgun, and we both had a Smith & Wesson M&P 45. The day before, we'd gone out and set up a hunting blind just off an old cornfield that hasn't been used in a long time. As we're walking up to this blind from the ranger, we noticed that the forest was dead silent. Looking back on it, we should have paid attention to that. We should have took the warning that nature was trying to give us. But it was early, and we wanted to get this hunt over with. And to be truthful, it was kind of exciting to go out there on this hunt. So, we just basically had other things on our mind. And unfortunately, we ignored nature's warning. So after about 200 yards, we make it to the blind, and like a flick of a switch, the forest had come back to life. At this point, it was starting to get late in the afternoon, and all of a sudden, we hear some coyotes crying and running towards us. We got our guns ready. I'm not 100% sure how many ran into the field, but at about 50 yards from us, we opened up on them. We'd gotten 3, and from what we noticed, there were decent-sized coyotes out there. About half an hour later, we get out of the blind to collect these coyotes. We knew that after we shot them, the other ones probably wouldn't come back. As soon as we both got out of the blind, I just had this bad feeling come over me, and the woods went quiet again. And when I say bad, it was like my body or my instincts were telling me that something wasn't right and we had to leave. But again, I just ignored it, because at this point, we have maybe 15 minutes of light left, and we want to get into the little ranger before it gets dark. As we walk up on these coyotes, we get this nasty smell of urine mixed with that wet dog smell. At first, we just thought it was the coyotes, but it turns out it wasn't. And that's when I noticed something in the tree line that was maybe about 30 yards away. It looked like a big-ass mastiff. Its fur was this grayish-red color. It had pointy ears, but its head was much bigger than a mastiff's head. And it had these amber-looking eyes. And they seemed to illuminate, like when you shine a flashlight on them. But there wasn't any light shining on these eyes. This thing looked at us as if it was confused by what we were doing. And it showed its teeth. That's when my friend decided to raise his gun, but I grabbed it and shoved it down, whispering to him, "No, you'll just piss him off." As I'm saying that, this thing stands up on its back legs. I shit you not. It went from a quadruped to a biped in an instant. And now this growling is getting a lot worse and a lot louder. What you need to know about me is I'm 6'2", 275 pounds. I wrestled and played football in high school and college, and my buddy is just a little bit smaller than me. But he's just as strong as me. This thing, though, it stood over the top of us by at least a foot, and it almost made me shit myself. I felt dwarfed by this thing. I knew that the two of us couldn't take this creature on if we wanted to, and believe me, wrestling this creature or fending off when it was attacking is not something that I wanted to do at all. This standoff between me and my friend and this creature seemed to last forever, but in reality, it maybe lasted a couple of seconds. I just know that when you're in that kind of situation, time slows down. And then, this thing let out this blood-curdling howl and runs up on all fours, picks up 2 of the dead coyotes, puts them under its arms, and runs back into the woods on 2 legs. And that's when I noticed my buddy take a couple of shots at it. I was pissed at him for that. I knew that that thing was just going to get pissed off. After my friend had his filling of shooting at this thing, I told him to run, and we took off. I don't think I've ever ran that fast in my life. At this point, I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see that thing, but I knew that it was there, because I could hear it running right next to us. It sounded like it was right on the side of us, keeping pace with us. We got to the little ranger, and I stop at the bed, lay my gun in it, and look around to see if I could see anything. I honestly didn't think I did, but I had this feeling as if we had more than one pair of eyes looking at us. Like maybe another one of those things, or maybe it was able to, I don't know, communicate with the coyotes. Maybe it's that was staring at us, but I don't know. Then my buddy started yelling to me to get my ass in the Ranger. I did, and I stepped on the gas back to the house. I told my family friend what we saw, and he said he hasn't seen them in years, and he thought he just had coyotes back there in the woods. I didn't ask what them were, because I knew what he was talking about, and I didn't want any more details. A couple of days later, though, he took us out to check in the field, the same one that we were at a couple of days before when we saw that creature. But this time, he brought his son, who happened to come home on leave from the Marines, and his 3 big Rottweilers. We were also armed with AR-15s and a .308 Winchester. As we get to the field, we noticed coyote body parts were all over the field. It looked like a battle happened or something. And believe me, those coyotes didn't come out on top. But from just looking around for a while, that family friend told us that they left, but they'd be back, and they wouldn't be happy when they returned. Finally, I asked him who they were. He looked at me like I was stupid, like I hadn't just seen these creatures for myself. He just stared at me for a second, and then he said, "The Wolfmen." That was enough for me. We got out of there shortly after that. A little while after that encounter, that man sold the property and moved down to Texas. I personally haven't been within 25 miles of that property since then. We act like these things aren't real, but trust me, friends, they are, and they're dangerous. More dangerous than you can imagine. Maybe more dangerous than we can even fathom. So please, if you encounter one, stay calm. Get the hell out of that area as safe as you can, but also as fast as you can. When I saw the Dogman, it wasn't a scary experience like everyone else says it was. In fact, it felt like a spiritual experience for me. Then again, I did have an entire lake in between us. It happened in the summertime on Lake Todd at about 6:30 to 6:45 in the morning. I was just sitting on a rock, enjoying the quiet morning on the lake and watching the sun come up. I had a canteen with coffee in it and was just enjoying the cool morning breeze on my skin. I saw movement across the lake and got excited that it might be some wildlife and I'd get to watch it. But instead, this huge gray wolf walked out of the woods. At first, when it came out, it was walking on 4 legs, like a normal wolf would do. I watched with a little bit of glee. This was really cool. I didn't even know there was wolves in that area. But then, this wolf trotted down to the bank and sat down on the shore. And it felt like it was staring right at me. And I realized this thing was really, really big. And the way it was sitting just wasn't right. It was more like it was crouching, like a catcher would in baseball. And it just sat there, staring at me, or at least in my direction, just like I was staring at it. It was like we were both trying to figure each other out, I guess. It started licking at its shoulder for a minute, and I got to see just how big the mouth was. I could probably fit my head in there, literally. This thing was massive. This isn't a normal wolf, I started thinking to myself. Then, after it was done grooming, it turned its attention back towards me and just stared at me again. At this time, I was still excited to be seeing what I thought I was seeing. Even if part of my brain knew that something wasn't right, I guess I was just telling myself that it was just a normal wolf. But then all of those thoughts went right out the window, because then it stood back up and it did this stretching thing. Its butt was higher in the air than its head, and its front legs were stretched out. And then, as I'm sitting here typing this to you right now, I swear to you, this thing stood up on its hind legs. It stood there and kept staring at me. It was like the only reason it stood up was to show me that it was capable of being a biped. It looked pretty tall, maybe 7 feet, maybe more. I'm not really good at that sort of thing, but I know that it was really big. It looked to me like it had ears that were pointed on the top of its head, and it looked pretty muscular too. The rest of the details weren't very clear since it was far away. It stood there like it was perfectly capable of standing on its hind legs, arms dangling at its sides like a person would do, not like a dog's legs would be. Still, even seeing this that I knew couldn't be possible, I was just mesmerized by this creature. I mean, sure, I was a little creeped out too, but I wasn't scared by any means. I just stared right back at this thing. I knew it wasn't a Sasquatch, since it didn't look anything like what I've heard their descriptions are, but I'd never heard of a Dogman at this point. It tilted its head at me like it was curious. Maybe it was confused as to why I wasn't running. I wasn't running because I believe there are things out there that protect the forest. I feel if you have a mutual respect for nature, the protectors won't hurt you. Maybe they can sense that you mean the forest no harm. And I guess that's why I wasn't afraid. And then this thing turned around, still on 2 feet, and slowly walked back into the forest. It walked like a human would, or like a Sasquatch would, just completely comfortable on 2 legs. It turned around once and looked in my direction again, lifted its nose like it was sniffing for something, and then went back into the trees. I watched for a little bit, curious to see if it would come back, but it never came out of the woods again. No, I wasn't afraid it was circling around the lake to get me. I didn't get the impression it wanted to hurt me at all. Some people are afraid of what they don't understand, but I wasn't. You see, I never felt threatened by this creature. I felt like it was more curious of what I was than eager to rip me apart. I left shortly after that, still amazed by what I saw. And then I started thinking, after I figured out what this creature was, that there are encounters where the people are terrified, sure, and they describe these creatures as pure evil, with this just air of malice, and these wicked grins that they give when they know that the people that are seeing them are terrified. But this creature didn't give off any air like that. So maybe these creatures are just like us. Some are good and some are bad. I don't know if we'll ever figure out the truth completely, but that's just my point of view. I hope there's other people out there that share that sentimentality. I would like to hear from you. Thanks. Hey man, my name is Bear. I live in East Tennessee and I'm 21 years old. I've recently been listening to a lot of Dogman encounters and researching what happened to me 6 years ago when I was 15. This is a story I've only told a few people and could only physically prove it to 2, one of which was my father. The other was my best friend, Big Dez. This happened in late summer, maybe July. When this happened, I was living in a rural area known as Lackawanna. It's a Cherokee name, although I'm not sure what it means. It's in Loudoun County, Tennessee. First, let me describe the geography and the lay of the land. The incident occurred at a place known to the locals as the Witch's Circle, and I'd always heard stories of things happening there, but we all chalked it up to silly stories made up to scare people. The stories were that a coven of local Wiccans used to go and meet there for meetings, away from the very Christian prying eyes of the locals. There's a path there that leads to, well, a circle that people used to drive their ATVs on. Until dark. Nobody ever stayed after dark. The circle at the end ended at the Tennessee River, a large river. Think of Tom Sawyer's Mississippi River raft trip, and that's pretty much the Tennessee. Then a year before my incident, someone went back there alone, stayed overnight, and was found crushed to death under his own four-wheeler later on. After that, nobody really talked about that place anymore. I think it was because now, this wasn't just a silly story. Someone that everyone knew had actually died. The folks around here are hardy and used to the outdoors, and most could survive on their own here if they were taught by their family to do so. I taught myself at a very young age how, since I spent so much time outdoors, and still do. But the woods were never the same to me after this. Anyhow, they closed that little dirt road after that, even placed a massive concrete slab like you see in the medians in cities, and that was all the way around so nobody could enter. Well, I've always been brave and adventurous, so I asked my dad if he'd drive me over there so I could go and check it out for myself, see if the stories were true, see if I could find any evidence. My father, who always admired my wild and independent spirit, obliged. He got off work at 5. We were out there soon after that. When we got there, I didn't say anything. I just got out of the truck and started making my way back into the overgrown dirt road. One thing I've always been taught is the importance of listening while in the wilderness. I didn't hear anything. No birds, no deers, nothing rummaging around the brush, no rabbits running around darting from the sound of my footfalls. We're talking nothing. Something just didn't feel right about this. I kept walking though, and you need to understand the way this road was built for following the encounter. I'll describe it to you. It had originally been made by dumping dirt and gravel, so it was raised about 8 feet off the rest of the forest floor. Both sides of the road were extremely overgrown with thick underbrush and saplings fighting for sunlight. I'm maybe 50 yards from the truck, just around the bend, and about 10 yards ahead of me, there was another bend. Imagine it as an S shape. I couldn't see the truck anymore, and my dad couldn't see me. Although I was startled by this strange feeling and the silence of the woods, the ever-approaching nightfall made it even worse. It was getting later in the day now, but still I kept going. The feeling I felt was one of warning, of something watching me hazardously. I fought off those instincts, though. I thought that maybe I was just trying to creep myself out. But I'll never forget that feeling now. I've never had it except for one other time, and I'll mention that later. So I keep myself to the right, walking near the tall, impenetrable brush. Suddenly, this feeling intensified, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt true terror in the wild. I stopped. My heart was now racing, and I just knew something wasn't right. I could no longer deny those instincts that were screaming to me to turn around and get the hell out of there, because something was now hunting me. I looked up, and my eyes met something else's about 5 yards in front of me. I saw it. 2 eyes, black and staring, unblinking, looking right into me. Not human. Predatory. It was then that I realized just how massive this thing was. This damn thing was hunched, almost crouched, hiding itself behind the tall, thick brush, but its head was at least 7 feet up off the ground. What the hell could get that size? I was so terrified and distracted by calculating the size of this thing, I regret to inform you that I didn't see much of its face or snout. Just black skin. Maybe a bit of white where its teeth were. I remember 2 ears that were dog-like, but instead of sticking up, they were slicked back, sort of like when a wolf growls or something. As soon as it realized that I could see it, it reached up with its hand and grabbed a sapling that was maybe 3 inches thick. It jumped backwards, using the spring and resistance of that sapling to soften its fall. It went 8 feet from that road to the forest floor and into the underbrush. I don't know what it was, but it still terrifies me. What you have to understand about me is I'm a man who's encountered bear in the wild multiple times, sometimes by myself, but I've never felt anything but curiosity at what this thing was doing. This creature, this bear, a creature I had a name for, a creature that I knew what it was capable of. I didn't feel anything like that danger. This thing just jumped back and disappeared so fast that it must have only taken a fraction of a second at most for it to move. For one moment, I froze, and then I realized I wasn't hearing retreating footsteps receding into the woods. I knew. It was still there. Whatever it was just hiding from me. And now, I felt like it was stalking me. I quickly turned around and walked from the right side away from the thick brush out into the middle of the road and ran as fast as I possibly could. I ran backwards until I came around the bend and I could look back and see the truck. Then I turned and bolted. At this point, I was almost crying with fear. I ran to my dad's window and I told him that I saw something in the woods, and he just asked me what it was. I'd only ever heard of Bigfoot, so I said Bigfoot. He laughed at first, but then realized I was so serious. I was almost in tears. Then he took me very seriously. I was shaking, and I told him everything that happened. He seemed intrigued, and he said he wanted to go back and see it. What in the hell is this man thinking, I thought. I begged him, pleaded with him not to go back there, but he was as stubborn as always. I told him it was big. Really, really frickin' big. Only I didn't say frickin'. He told me he was going, and that was that. I was terrified. Now my dad weighs like 400 pounds. He's a big man. I knew this thing could kill him in less than a second, though. I am not the least bit ashamed to admit that I started crying. I told him if he had to go there, if he needed to satisfy his curiosity, then I'd follow him. I wasn't going to let him die. And that's truly what I felt was going to happen if we went back there. And I sure as hell wasn't going to stay there by myself. So, we walked back. Honestly, I was so emotional, things seemed almost numb to me. I think I might have actually been going into shock, honestly. We went to where I told him I saw the damn thing, and sure enough, 2 big-ass indentations on the top of the slope, but dug in, like claws or something. And the tree that I told him it snapped, sure enough, was snapped in about 2 places, 8 feet up off the ground. He took a picture with his old flip phone, but I don't think he has that picture anymore. And honestly, it's a flip phone, so how good would that picture have been anyway? Creepily enough, right where that thing had been standing were 2 small animal skulls and a few bones, but they were old, and I'm sure completely unrelated. But honestly, it just added fuel to the fire. It didn't help the situation at all. And then I remembered that I never heard it leave, so I grabbed my dad and started trying to pull him back up the road. That's when we heard something that sounded like a biped, moving, and moving quickly. Now you asked me how I knew it was a biped. When you're out in nature so much, and you hunt as often as we do, you know the difference. Just trust me on that. We both went quiet and listened. What scares me the most to this day is that they weren't leaving. They were stalking slowly around us, circling into the direction to put itself between us and the truck. To me, it said that thing at least had some kind of intelligence. It knew that it was cutting off our escape route. My dad and I backed up and got the hell out of there as fast as we could. Man, do I hate that memory. The only other incident, then the last thing that happened while we were out there, moving back to the truck, was this strange, extremely deep, extremely loud howl that came from over the ridge in the same direction of that thing. And then one night, a few weeks later, I was trying to sleep in my room. My head is by a thin glass window with about an 8-foot drop to the ground outside. There's a tiny goldfish pond out there that we had built a few years before that. This night, it was storming something awful. The whole house felt like it was shaking. I tried to watch TV, but it was so loud, with thunder and lightning and rain, that I couldn't hear and just turned it off. I drifted to sleep before waking to a sound not quite unlike thunder, until I fully awoke. Immediately, I was startled. I had that feeling again that just something wasn't right. It was still storming outside, but now there was a very low, deep growling noise right outside of my window. My blinds were closed, but they could have been steel, and I still would have been terrified. This wasn't a dog stopping for a drink at the pond. It was coming from near the top of my window, so almost 10 feet up off of where it should have been if it were standing outside. I remembered the massive thing in the woods and shuddered. Honestly, I felt it had recognized my scent or something and found me, and I knew it could easily reach in and tear me to pieces. Talk about fear. I'd never been that scared in my life. All I could do was just listen to it continue to growl until it started getting more violent and threatening. And then I jumped from my bed and ran all the way to my parents' room like one tiny little child. But you know what? That's where we kept all the friggin' guns. And that was it. Didn't see or hear it again. Only other thing I could mention is my dad hearing and seeing proof, and a good friend of mine hearing the howling one night by a fire. That was the last time I've seen or heard anything like it. One other thing though, thinking about its ears, and especially that wolf-like growling, I don't think it was Bigfoot anymore. And most Bigfoot encounters I hear are more curious in nature. This thing just made me feel like it was bloodthirsty. I think I saw a Dogman, or maybe a werewolf. I'm not sure what it was out there, but it definitely instilled the fear of some kind of monster. What do you think of this? I know you have no clue who I am, but I would like to share an encounter with you. A story that might be hard to believe, if you wouldn't mind it. They call me Bo, and I'm a former Army mechanic. I had my encounter when I was out hunting deer in New River Park. I'd got there by 7:30 in the morning, and by about noon I decided to walk to my truck to get a sandwich and something to drink. I'm heading back to the woods, just wallowing down the trail, and I hear something from the thicket about 40 to 50 yards away. I stopped and crouched down, readying my rifle in case it was a hog or deer. That way I'd be able to bring home the meat. All of a sudden though, I see this light brown hair, so I'm thinking maybe it's a deer, and immediately my heart starts to race. But then I hear this noise like a grunt, so I think maybe it's a great big buck, and it's coming this way. This thing has to be massive, so my pulse gets even faster. As this thing continues to move, it slowly walks towards me, and all of a sudden, my heart drops when I realize whatever this thing is too big to be a buck. And there's no way a buck would be walking towards me like that. So I start thinking, maybe it's an elk, since there are a few around here. It slowly continues walking, but the thing that gets me, and still gives me nightmares to this day, is this thing was about 4 to 6 feet tall on all 4 legs. I'm 6'6", I weigh 200 pounds, and the brush is over my head. Then this thing stands up on 2 legs, and I see this evil wolf's head rise about a foot from the brush. So this thing has to be easy 8 to 9 feet tall. It starts sniffing the air, then looks at me with its deep, dark red eyes. They were absolutely wild looking, and it had this vicious intent. It felt like it was staring right into my soul. My heart felt like it was going to stop. Being an experienced hunter, I decided to stay completely still, but the fear I felt in that moment was like nothing I had ever felt before. Then this werewolf begins to snarl in my direction, and of course now I'm freaking out. I got my 308 ready and off the safety. If I had to, I'd try and slow it down till I got up to the ridge. Suddenly it dropped down on all fours again and started barreling right at me. I knew if I shot, I'd only get one shot, so I had to wait. As this thing is running full speed, I knew it would be on me in a second. Then all of a sudden, I hear this deafening roar behind me. I hear something running behind me as well, and glance over my shoulder to notice a second werewolf with dark, almost black fur running up behind me. I think to myself, I am completely screwed. The only thing running through my mind was, I have two werewolves running full speed at me. What in the hell was I going to do? I'd never see my family again, that was for sure. The one that was behind me was almost to me. It was faster than the other one, but I could hear the first one I saw getting closer too. And right as this massive creature jumps at me, I try to hit the ground, only to realize they weren't headed to me at all. They were charging each other. I don't even know if they realized I was there. Then they commence in this extremely bloody, brutal battle between the two of them. I'm laying there on my back in shock as they fight, just staring at these two things that aren't even supposed to exist, trying to get my mind to wrap around it, but still unable to move. They're both standing on their hind legs. The lighter brown one gets knocked back by the black one, and they roll down the hill, flipping and swatting and clawing and biting the whole way down. When they were about 20 yards down the hill, I decided that now would be a good time to get the hell out of there and book it. But my legs, they still wouldn't move. I was stuck in this most primal fear, something I'd never felt before. The two now below me on this hill are still fighting, and both are covered in blood and dirt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got the feeling back in my legs and began to run. The light brown wolf, who had just been body slammed by that bigger black wolf, clawed with its hind legs and tore into the black wolf's stomach. The brown one got back on its feet and started running in the same direction I was. And now I'm running at full speed. For all I'm worth, I glanced over my shoulder and saw that brown one get caught by the back with one of those black wolf's claws, which dug deep into its side. The black one grabbed the brown one's shoulder in its mouth and flung it back down the hill again. As the brown one tumbled back down the hill, it seemed to be able to get back on all fours and continued running down the hill and back into the brush. I have no clue why I stopped to look back at that big black wolf, which was now staring at me. No good answer for you, so I didn't even ask. I guess I was just curious. I noticed these deep gashes and flesh hanging off of its stomach and sides. The way it looked at me made my blood turn to concrete, because it was just looking at me with this almost human grin across its jaw. Then it let out another ear-shattering roar. It looked at me one more time, then followed the smaller one way down from me. To this day, I believe I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but I got to see this encounter with these two dogmen, or werewolves, or whatever you want to call them. I don't know why, but I can still remember the look on that big black wolf's eyes. It just stared me down after it won. Like it was saying, I'm the alpha of the woods. They're mine. I just kicked the shit out of this other monster, so if you want to come have at it, I'm game. I have since left my tree stand and a couple $100 worth of gear to rot in those woods. I will not go back in that area, because I know that he ran off one, and now it's probably looking for territory of its own. Those two are kings of that mountain. I'm never going back there. I don't ever want to see those things again. I've sensed that encounter only told my fiancé. We talked it over and both agreed that the older, more Bible-fearing folk around this town would never believe me, so I keep it to myself. I'm happy to share with you. I'm just glad to be home safe with my fiancé. We've since then had a beautiful little girl, and I promised my fiancé that I would never step in the woods of that mountain range again. I don't want to be eaten and miss the life of my child. I'm sorry this was long, but I had to tell the world about this amazing experience I had. I just know that anywhere else I would tell this story, people would scoff at me. They wouldn't believe me. They'd call me a liar or crazy. So I want to thank you for helping me get this off my chest. Your YouTube channel made me realize that others out there have seen this beast as well, and it made it easier for me to talk about it. For the record, these things looked like the Van Helsing werewolf. I'm sorry if this is all messed up and all over the place, but the fear I feel from this still scares the shit out of me, and just typing it down is making me relive that encounter. I'm sitting here shaking, trying to remember every detail that I can for you. These things I saw were absolutely massive, ripped like a bodybuilder, huge arms and broad shoulders. It dwarfed me, and like I said, I'm 6'6". This thing had to be 8 feet tall. I've never felt that inferior around any type of creature. I realized that this thing was the most dangerous thing in the woods, and man is not as far up the food chain as we think. So I hope you use this encounter to let people know that we ain't the top of the food chain like we want to be. I would just like my words to get out to people. Please let them know that Tennessee has these creatures too. But there's people like you that can share their story and get them out there. If anything, it just gets it off of our chest. At most, maybe it'll save someone's life one day. Thanks again for listening to me. I hope you have a good night. And stay safe out in the woods. Because like you said, things really do go bump in the night. Bo from Tennessee. Okay, Supernaturalist, picture this. It's a sunny summer day in mid-July. I was at Rough River Lake with my brother, sister-in-law, and fiancé. Sounds like a great day, right? Well, it was, until we saw those things watching us from the woods. We'd been there a few hours, tossing around the football, splashing the water at the girls. They were sunbathing. We thought it was funny. We threw back some brewskis. It was after that I noticed something watching us from the trees. I didn't know what it was at first. It was just swaying back and forth, like it was trying to get a good look at us. I thought it might be a person. But then I noticed just how tall this thing was. Its head was directly underneath the branches that I knew were way over my own head. You see, I'd gone over to that same area to take a leak earlier, so I knew how tall the branches were from the ground. Now, I tried not to make it obvious that I noticed it, but I continued to watch it. At times, I could barely see this thing. Whatever it was. It was incredible at camouflaging itself. I'd glance back over every so often. It was still there every time I looked. And it started to really creep me out. What was it? Why was it just watching us? I casually kneeled down and positioned my head to where I could look directly at it. But I was trying not to be obvious. As I stared at it, I started to notice what looked like, well, like a werewolf. I only saw its head, but then I got a good look at its shoulders and some of its chest. The rest was behind a bunch of bushes. Man, I'm telling you, this thing looked like a German shepherd. It had a long muzzle, tall ears, big eyes. I couldn't tell what color the eyes were from the distance that I was at, though. But I can tell you it had really, really broad shoulders, muscular upper arms, and a wide chest. And it looked to me like it was dark in color, but I can't be sure. It could have just been a trick that the shadows of the bushes and the trees were playing on my eyes. And then I noticed another one of them, standing about 100 or so feet from the first one. Now let me tell you this. I've been in a couple life and death situations. I've been scared out of my mind. But here, and now, seeing these creatures watching us, the people that I cared about most in this world, my heart started pounding out of my chest. If there's two over there, were there more? How many of those things were out there? Did they have us surrounded? The second one looked pretty much like the first one, only it looked like it might be lighter in color, but it had the same head, same muzzle, same big-ass shoulders and arms and chest. At this point, I wanted to scream to the others to run to the car, but I let cooler heads prevail. Like I said though, my mind was racing. I kept thinking whether or not they were going to attack us, how many we were up against, and the realist in me still telling me that there was a logical explanation for what I was looking at. But I pushed all thoughts of impossibility out of my head, because this was really happening. I was looking at these creatures, and I knew what they weren't. They weren't wolves, they weren't bears, they weren't people in some really messed up costume. These creatures, for all intents and purposes, looked like werewolves. So I did the only thing that I could do. I went to my brother and quietly and casually told him to look at what I was looking at. It took him a couple tries, almost a minute or so, to see them, because these things just blended in so well. And then, when he finally saw them, I knew just what he was looking at, because his eyes went wide. He looked just as scared as me. And I've never seen my brother scared like that. Hell, I've never seen my brother scared at all. I told him it was time to go. And you know what? He didn't disagree with me either. We went to the girls and told them to just trust us. That we had to leave. That something out there was making this little adventure no longer safe. They listened without hesitation. I think they knew by our expressions that it wasn't time to ask for details. We walked over to the car and then quickly hopped in, took off, and drove fast to get out of there. When we were sure that it was safe, I told the girls what we'd seen. Man, we had a hell of a time convincing them, but eventually, when I put it on my grandma's life, they believed us. Now, I don't know if they were planning to attack, if there were more around there, or what their intentions were. I don't know if they were just watching us, or if they were trying to figure out what we were, like I was trying to figure out what they were. But what I do know is that it really happened. That I saw these creatures that everybody refers to as Dogmen. And the other thing I know is I don't go into the woods anymore. I want everybody listening to just stay safe and be aware of your surroundings. Because this day that I had that encounter was a perfectly normal, fun day. We were just out having a good time. Until those things made themselves known. I don't look at the world the same way anymore. And I think that's for the better. Thank you for presenting this. I appreciate you, and I enjoy your channel. Have a good night. Personally, I don't believe in werewolves, or creatures like Bigfoot. But I do believe that there are monsters out there. In fact, I have a story I can share with you, in which I have an experience with a monster all of my own. It was one night when I was left home alone by myself playing video games when my parents were out, and I believe a monster tried to break into my house. Now you see, I use the term monster because that's the only way I know how to accurately describe the way it looked. In reality, it closely resembled a werewolf, but I tried to be logical about it, and I realized that werewolves aren't supposed to be real. I personally don't believe that there are people that turn into these things under a full moon. But I cannot deny that the thing I saw that night was most certainly real though. Had it gotten into my house like it wanted to, there's no telling if I'd still be here today to tell you my story. All around our house, we had a yard, and in the back was probably about 3 acres of small woods. Those woods led directly to our neighbor's house. Directly in front of the house was the driveway that led to the road, and on the other side of the road were tall hedges. Had we not had those hedges, there wouldn't be much privacy, and maybe if we were closer to the neighbors, this might not have happened. Anyways, this happened to me when I was 15 and still in high school, a freshman. My parents were out for a date night, and when they did that, they usually didn't get back until super late, usually after midnight. So I was left home to play video games and watch TV. Typical teenager stuff. Since my parents have a large screen TV in the living room, I hooked up my PS3 and I was playing games on it. I'll give you a quick layout of our house. As soon as you walk in the door, the TV is directly to the right and facing the left. To the left is the couch, which faces the TV, and there's a large window perpendicular to the front door. From the outside, if you were looking in the front window, you'd have full view of the living room, as well as the dining area, which sits back behind the living room. If you're in the living room, then you walk past the TV, you can go right down the small hallway, which leads to my parents' room and a small bathroom. If you turn left and go down that way, you go down another small hallway, which leads to my bedroom and another small bathroom. Now that you kind of know what the house looks like, this is what happened. I stopped playing games and quickly got up to get a drink of water. As I was walking back from the kitchen though, I noticed something I didn't before. I saw big red eyes peering at me through the window. When I saw those eyes, I just lost it. I turned around and ran and locked myself in my bedroom. I mean, I was completely freaking out. I felt like a little kid who had just seen a monster outside. When I went in my room though, I started looking through the blinds just a little bit, but I didn't want to move the blinds that much because I knew that it had seen me run to my room. So I didn't want to move the window blinds. Then it started moving. I followed that movement. It followed me towards my bedroom. Then it moved over to the front of my window. Because of how big the silhouette of this thing was, it must have been around 7 to 8 feet tall. It had a long tail which curled up behind it. I really couldn't believe it. I was looking at a werewolf. I thought to myself, it was really a werewolf. Even before I saw it in full, the shape of this thing was a dead giveaway. Now, I had broken my window blinds months ago by wrestling too much with my friends, and it was never fixed. Pretty crappy during this situation. They didn't quite close all the way, which meant that this thing had free rein to look fully into my window, right at me. There's virtually nothing I could do but try and hide all the way in the corner. I had my light off, and I was hiding while this thing scanned my room looking for me. I really couldn't believe what I was looking at. It had to be a werewolf. I just kept telling myself that over and over and over. The head and the mane just looked like a werewolf that you would see in that movie Bad Moon. It looked to be huge. It stood upright on 2 legs. It was covered in long dark fur that almost looked matted. It had pointy ears just like a dog does. The eyes glowed this deep, dull red with hints of yellow in them. Its face was what really confused me though, because the way it looked totally defied understanding. It leaned in so close to the glass that you could see its breath on the window and the condensation building up on the glass. I don't think that it could see me though, because my light was off, but after a few minutes, it pulled its head back and walked around to the other side of the house. This thing was heavy. You could tell that it weighed a lot, because every time it took a step, you could hear the thud on the ground. I jumped up and quickly locked my door and ran back to the corner to sit down again, listening for whatever this thing was and what it was going to do next. I could faintly hear my game, which was paused, and then it was silent for a moment. I kept listening, and then that's when I heard the back sliding glass door rattle. I was horrified. This thing was trying to open the sliding glass door to get into the house. It was shaking harder and harder, more and more violent each time. I began to cry. I was so scared. I left my phone in the living room, so I had nothing to do to call for help. There was nobody that I could reach out to. I didn't know what to do. At the time, it was maybe 9:45, and I knew my parents wouldn't be home for a few more hours. I had no way of contacting anybody, and nothing that I could do but wait for this thing to get into the house. If this thing broke into the house, I was a goner. It tried and tried at the door for a while before just stopping entirely. During that entire time, I was terrified. I didn't know what I was going to do. But after that, I didn't hear anything more. I didn't even hear it walk away. I could hear it walking around the house, but when this thing left, I never heard it leave. I still heard my game, which was just a faint noise, but it was still sitting there paused. I remember thinking that I should have turned that damn TV off so I could get a better listen in case that thing was walking around, circling, trying to find another way in. I decided I was just going to sit there and wait until my parents got back. I didn't know how long it was, but eventually my mom and dad came home, and it was only around 11 p.m. To me, it felt like I was waiting for hours. They got back because my mother had this habit of coming down with terrible migraines, and she wanted to cut the date short because she had one of them that night. When they came home, my mother got some aspirin, and they were both wondering why I had locked myself in my bedroom with the lights off. When I told them I thought I heard an intruder trying to break into the house, my dad looked at me very strangely and then investigated the back door after I told them that's where they were trying to break in. But there were no signs. No signs of a monster that was trying to break into the house. No footprints, no handprints, no nothing. There wasn't even any smudges on the glass. It was like I just hallucinated the whole thing or something. But it wasn't a hallucination. I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. I'm no fool, and I wouldn't dare tell my parents this because they would never believe me. So fast forward in time. As an adult, that's still one of the most horrific things that I've ever experienced. I didn't believe in monsters before that, but I do now. And I know for a fact that they're real.